If you were to be in charge of the DoD today, what would you do?
It would be...
This is Shyam Sankar, CTO at Palantir, one of the biggest data solutions company contracted to the US military.
In an effort to have a perception of fair competition, we have created so much process that we either have fair competition nor speed. The European process is even more slow because there's an even greater emphasis on how do I show fairness across all of the EU states. We are spending at historic lows relative to the Cold War.
What is it in context of GDP? 15%?
2 to 3%.
What was it in the Cold War?
At its peak, I think it's like...
Shyam, I'm so excited for this. Now, you were described to me by Joe Lonsdale as the hardest working person in Silicon Valley, and that's coming from Joe. So first, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm so thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me, Harry.
Not at all, but I do want to start on that. I want to unpack just that work ethic a little bit. I think I'm a armchair psychologist. I think a lot's driven by childhood. Where do you think you get that work ethic and drive from?
I think it comes from my father. You know, my father, as a young man in his 20s, he left India to set up the first pharmaceutical manufacturing facility in India, and I'd say in Africa, sorry. And even before that, he was the youngest of 9 children. And he lived in this structure where all of his siblings were working their ass off to send him to college. And this sense of, look, I have to make something of this, given all this opportunity I've been given. And, he was a great man.
And so that inspired you that the only way to win was by working hard?
That there was kind of this obligation to family, to society, that there's just so much value in that. And I think in his life, in many ways, I think you could say it would be kind of a trivial story if it was like, look, my dad was this guy who worked really hard. He took this risk and it all worked out. That's not what happened. It all didn't work out. You know, when my dad went to Nigeria, when I was a young kid, we suffered horrible armed violence. He was almost executed. He had to start over. We fled Nigeria. We resettled in the US effectively as refugees, starting from scratch. And I was raised, and he lived his life with this deep understanding of the counterfactual, that like, no matter how bad it is, remember what it could have been. You know, your alternative to this present moment is being dead in a ditch, and how grateful you should be for that, and how you should not squander the opportunity that you have as a consequence of that.
How old were you when you had to restart?
I was 2.5. So fortunately, you know, many of those, 2.5, 3, I was not mentally scarred, traumatically scarred by that, but it had a profound effect on my parents.
Yeah. Can I ask, when you look back on your lessons from them and seeing them, how do you think it impacted you?
It really gave me this sense of looking forward. So like, look, all these bad things happen. What are you supposed to do about it? What the most productive thing you can do about it is stick together as a unit and focus on what you could do next. And support each other through that, and support each other's ambitions. I think accomplishing great things in the world very rarely can be done alone. At least I've never experienced that. It's really the unit. There's all these unsung heroes. It's better to think about it as a rock band, not a solo act. And getting that chemistry right is, I think, crucial. And it's as crucial at home as it is in business.
Can I ask you, have you seen General McRaven's commencement speech where he says about the importance of making your bed at the start of every day? And one of his is find someone to help you paddle. And it's very much along those lines. Can I ask, with that realization that bad things happen and it's about putting your next step forward, do you believe in luck? And how do you think about the importance of luck versus pure hard work in factoring towards success?
I kind of have a mixed feeling on it. On one end, I think I'm not sure why it's productive to believe in luck, especially if you think your luck can vary, right? So, I think the most productive mind frame is something like, I have good luck, and the only thing I actually have control over is how hard I work. And so let me focus on that part of it. And how smart I work, sure. But I have the other view of it is there such a thing as luck? Probably. But it's like quantum. You know, we often think it's like, what matters more, luck or hard work? Or it's like, why not both? And only one of these variables do you really have a lot of control over. So I think, we probably somehow in this current epoch, I think we've undervalued or underfocused on hard work and overemphasized the role of luck in success.
I don't think it's that, actually. I think we've just overvalued the role of fake humility, which is like, I think a lot of us are happy to admit to ourselves, I worked my ass off and I got to where I am largely because of that. But you can't say, yeah, I worked my ass off and I deserve to be here. I think that's a tough thing. Can I ask you, how did Palantir come to be? Because you were like Zoom in the early days. This was like Kevin Hart's and like, I think 2002, 2003 style. This was like dawn of like Silicon Valley greats.
Yeah. So for the audience, this is Zoom with an X, which was the money transfer company that subsequently ended up with PayPal. And that was great. Like I really got to the Valley, maybe backing up a little bit. I got to the Valley because in this period of time, having graduated from Cornell, your opportunities as an engineer were really finance, consulting, or maybe a very large tech company where you were going to be a cog in the machine. Like Google didn't even come to the campus to recruit in those days. And so I just needed to get to Silicon Valley. I went to Stanford for that. Within 2 months of getting to Stanford, I had like begged and broken down Kevin Hart's door to get a job at Zoom. And that's really how this kind of all started. So I joined Zoom as the 5th employee, and I spent 3 amazing and wonderful years there. But when through Joe's freshman year roommate, actually, I learned about Palantir, this very eclectic character, Gabe Rosen, who is a poet who swims at the South End Rowing Club in freezing cold San Francisco Bay waters. I mean, this guy you can't really put in a box, but he's like, you really need to meet Joe and hear about this company. And at the time, it was 12 people, and they wanted to work on problems of national security. My uncle was a victim of the 2006 coordinated train bombings in Bombay. I was very much, I was in upstate New York during 9/11. I think that was a seminal moment for many, many folks of my generation. I actually tried to drop out of school to join CIA, but I think everyone had that idea at that time. I didn't even have a college degree, so they didn't quite respond to my electronic application. And so, I would have much rather, failed, and it certainly seemed in 2005, Palantir, like this, it wasn't at all clear how it was going to work, but I would have much rather failed working on something that I thought was so important.
What state was Palantir in 2005? Just help, because we see it today as this incredible company serving many different governments around the world. Where was it in 2005? Like, where was the entry point for you?
Really, they had focused on only hiring engineers, and of course I'm an engineer by background, but I think they kind of figured out that they really wouldn't want my code in production, and so they were kind of at the point where there's like, okay, well, who's going to actually interact with the customers to shape how we're building the product? And we don't want some sort of product manager who's thinking, like, this is a very deep and complicated problem. The intersection of the domain and the software will be nuanced. You have a massive asymmetry of information that most of the software you're deploying is into a classified environment where at the time, none of us had clearances. We were all wild outsiders with no knowledge of what was happening behind those, these magical doors, but just a kind of almost maniacal commitment to trying to solve the problem nonetheless.
How do you think you were so successful then? Because when I look at like Anduril, obviously we mentioned Trey beforehand. When we look at like Anduril, a lot of the success I always believed was the combination of Palmer and Trey, and actually Trey bringing a lot of the experience, probably from Palantir, of how government and selling to government works. If you were the V1, how on earth did you make it work when no one had a clue how to do it?
We're just committed to building the right product. And I don't want that to sound naive, because actually I think it took us longer and was harder because we didn't know how to sell to government. There was all these things that were kind of 0 to 1. There was no one else to really learn from. All the people who really knew it were not of the technology world and couldn't get it to work in our context anyways. So we had to kind of flail our way through feeling it out from first principles and developing a new playbook that was going to work. And I think a playbook that subsequently has been really valuable to the rest of it.
Can I ask, what is that? We're just jumping around here, but this is what I love about the show. But Trey said you literally kind of built a new business model for selling to governments and defense tech. What is that playbook?
If you were to follow, so before I tell you what the new playbook is, just understand the old playbook, right? The way the government really wants to buy everything is to pay you by the hour to build it. So some assessment of who should be doing it, but fundamentally it's a labor model, and it's a labor model where they really want, and through cost accounting and audits, will look at your actual costs. They will build in overhead rates. They will then say, this is how much profit you're allowed to have. It's kind of actually pretty communist for a country whose entire economic engine has been powered by capitalism as a monopsonist buyer. And you can say, well, why is this? Why is it? Because it's not totally crazy. But assume you're the only buyer for a product in the world. You're the only buyer for the aircraft carrier. How should I compensate someone who's building an aircraft carrier for me? It's like, what's a fair price to pay? So the way that they solved this, really starting in the last century, was thinking about as cost plus. I don't know, it seems fair that, it costs you something, you have to pay people, you have to buy materials, and I'll give you some profit on top of that. Now, this has obvious consequences in terms of what the long-term incentives end up being. Why would you ever invest in innovation? Why would, and to the extent the government wants you to innovate, they actually pay you the money to do the R&D. You're not putting your money into it, really. You're putting their money into it. And so as the world transitioned from a place where all of the R&D was done by the government, 50s, 60s, obviously the preponderance of R&D is done by the commercial world. This model makes no sense. You really want to leverage the beauty of what we've really pioneered in the Valley is this high risk, high return approach.
Can I jump in and just ask, you mentioned there kind of, well, if you're the only buyer of said product, but I believe there's always a market. And so you could sell that aircraft to the US, but you could also sell it to the UK or to France or Germany or any others. There's probably 10 buyers, in which case, if you want the concentrated supply, well, then you can pay a premium. And then we have an efficient market. Am I wrong?
I think you're right. I think I was trying to steelman it, which is like, okay, how did we end up here? Like, let's just assume, it's Chesterton's fence. We didn't end up here because somehow the system is totally broken and incompetent. There was some thinking to it. But I think we're now in a world where the second order consequences of that system are dominating. And that's what's leading to a structural inability to innovate. Technology is supposed to make things cheaper. Somehow that doesn't happen in government. Why? And to the extent things do get cheaper, they get cheaper because they're benefiting from the massive tailwinds from the commercial markets R&D that then subsequently makes its way to government.
Sorry, is that not like anything? Is that not like anything in government though? There's no profit incentive. Why is the NHS not always looking to cost cut? Because there's no benefits of getting rid of middle management.
And so I think the great opportunity, and really, so the playbook was, look, I'm not going to let you pay me by the hour. I'm going to refuse to accept any revenue that's services based from you. And instead, I'm going to build a product. And I'm going to keep investing in the product. And that means I have to go sell a part of my company to finance that, right? I have to go raise money to go do this. But this product's going to be so good, you're going to want to buy it. And when you're going to buy it on a license fee basis. You're going to pay some sort of subscription, software as a service. I know to the Silicon Valley listeners, this is like, obviously, what are you talking about? How is this? But there's a lot of brain damage to getting the government to this model. Even now, we've made a huge amount of headway. But the low entropy, the like lowest path, least resistance is to try to pay someone by the hour.
What was their reaction? It's a big shift for them to make mentally.
One of the other complexities of government is there's a disconnect between who is the buyer exactly and who is the user. And so in the early days, and even today, the preponderance of our time is spent with the user. How do I know I'm building the right product? How do I know what I should be building next? Where is the utility? How do I get these folks who are the users to tell the buyers, no, really, this is way better? If you go to the buyers, they're going to always want to push you down to the conventional model of how do I buy this by the hour? And so I think that the way to do it is to create capability that's so compelling, so necessary, that people are willing to go through a more difficult but more rewarding process in order to acquire it.
Can I ask, on decision makers, what does the decision-making structure look like when selling to governments? Is it committees? Is it single points? Is it panels? How does that look?
It's closer to committees. I mean, it's still a Byzantine process. I'm not sure even after 18 years of doing this, could really fully put it on a piece of paper and kind of tell you it out. You're kind of feeling your way through it. But, people would say that you need a requirement, you need resource, i.e. money, and you need a contract. And I think at a highest level, you're trying to figure out how do you line up those three elements within the government customer you're working with to accomplish this. Now, the pathing of doing that, I think, is specific to every opportunity you're kind of going after.
So I actually spoke to many, many people before the show, as you know, and they said one of the things that you and Palantir have done so well is really just nailing the land and expand model with government contracts. What do you think has enabled you to do that so successfully? And then do you get real margin optimization? Because once you're in, it's just freaking hard to get you're retained. It's such a sticky customer.
There's two pieces to this. The first is that the land and expand doesn't work the way it does for commercial SaaS companies. What you're not trying to do is, it very much is about expanding the product surface area. So as opposed to the license surface area, or I'm trying to get more users, it's not sales driven expansion. It's actually product driven expansion. And if you think about how do I connect up more of what this customer is doing, like I've landed with this capability. How do I expand to lateral capabilities that are valuable to them? Many of those capabilities, you're not going to think those things up in Palo Alto eating strawberries. Like you need to be in Djibouti or in Kandahar or in Balad or in Ramstein, sitting with the users to understand what's next, because that the truth is out there. It's not in some document somewhere. It's not in DC. The deep understanding of what's missing that you can build true stickiness around. That's one dimension. Other dimension of this, like the reason you have to be there, is how are you to your margin optimization. It doesn't actually come from lock-in or kind of just like rent collection. It actually comes from understanding how do I continuously productize and create the efficiency in how I deliver what I deliver. There are unique constraints in this environment, right? You don't have one big multi-tenant or three big multi-tenant geographic instances of your software that you're running on the public internet. You're delivering software into air-gapped environments that are tightly controlled and constrained, and people need clearances to access them. And so you need to have some sort of product methodology to invest in the software infrastructure. You have your software, then you have the infrastructure below that is essentially an army of robots that manages your software in production. Because otherwise, you're going to end up deploying a team of 20 people to go manage your software in these environments, and you're going to have a really hard time getting to scale.
Can I ask, how do you think about propensity to buy within governments? Again, you're like, what? This schedule's completely gone out the window. I'm loving this. But like propensity to buy with governments, when you compare software versus hardware, are they the same? Are mindsets the same? Or do they differ in terms of their approaches?
Yeah, the mindset is the whole government system is geared up to buy hardware because they kind of, especially in the US government, but I think you can see it's analogous everywhere. Living in a world where government used to finance all R&D, it starts with R&D. Okay, I'm going to pay you to do some R&D, build a prototype. If I like this thing, I'm going to procure it. I'm going to buy it at scale. Once I've procured it, I have to sustain it. So they expect costs to go like this. Of course, that's not how software works at all, right? Software, first of all, software R&D costs only increase. It's not, no investor thinks Microsoft's going to spend less in the future on R&D than they spend in the present moment. That would be crazy. But the government somehow expects that to be true. And the second part is there is no difference in our modern technology world between procurement and sustainment. Like those concepts, even as I say the words, they may be like, what do you mean exactly here? You're delivering software as a service. You're continuously innovating on it. It's never done. I think the government has absorbed that idea that software is never done, but they haven't absorbed the idea that means there's at least a constant cost.
Can we just hone in on one particular country, being yours? Because you said a great statement when we chatted before. But you didn't expand on any of these, so thanks for the cliffhangers. They were great, like titles for a show, by the way. But I was like, okay, writing a follow-up question is interesting. America has a defense industrial problem. Why does America have a defense industrial problem? Can you help me understand this?
Yeah. Well, at the risk of making a long story long, I think you could think about, like, when were we amazing at this? And I think it was really at the dawn of World War II. And there's this great book by Arthur Herman called The Arsenal of Democracy. It's probably the book I'm most obsessed with right now, and I've read it a couple times. And it really talks about how the industrial mobilization worked. We brought Bill Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who was a very senior executive at Ford and General Motors, into government. We made him from a civilian to an Army 3-star general. He was commissioned as a 3-star general, and he was in charge of the industrial mobilization. And we had this immense luxury during World War II, which was that we were at peace, Britain was at war, and we were supplying Britain. We had 18 months when we were not getting shot at to turn on our industrial production, to build factories and to retool them. And that took 18 months. We needed that time. The counterfactual would have been brutal. We also needed to leverage American industry. We were at that time, we had just figured out mass production, and we, America, had just figured out mass production. It was our unique strength in the world. So we applied that mass production technique not to Model Ts, we turned it to bombers and fighters and tanks and all the machinery of war you needed to actually help the Brits go forth, and then subsequently to help America fight as well. We had these crazy founders. It was Henry Kaiser. We think of Lockheed Martin, but it was Glenn Martin. It wasn't Northrop Grumman. It was Jack Northrop. All of that innovation was not driven by faceless companies run by 8th generation leaders. They were built and run by these just maverick founders, people we would recognize their personality structure in the Valley today. I think as a consequence, after we won the Cold War, rightly, we expected a peace dividend. Why would you continue to? I think it's hard for a legitimate democracy to continue to sustain that level of spending in the absence of an adversary. So in 1993, the then Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, who was himself an entrepreneur, he started a Silicon Valley company called Electronic Systems Laboratories. He had what was called the Last Supper. He invited the 51 defense primes. Today we have 5. Back then we had 51. He invited the 51 defense primes in and he said, look, the budget is going to get much smaller. And it did. For every dollar they had before, they had 33 cents going forward. Not all of you are going to survive. I'm kind of giving you permission and a mandate to consolidate, to get lean, to get efficient. And so this is how we went from 51 to 5. And I think the off-sided consequence of doing this is that the industrial base became less competitive. Oh, we only have 5 people to pick a month. So, prices are high or something like that. And there's some truth to that. But I think the much more profound consequence of the Last Supper is it began a deep financialization of defense. It became about dividends and buybacks and leverage ratios. It became about M&A. New venture formation was about spin-outs and mergers, not about venture-backed, creative, risk-taking ideas to go build entirely new things.
And so the financialization was a negative thing.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because all the emphasis went away from creative, big ideas. Alex Karp says this all the time. It's like no great company was created primarily to make money. Like yes, there's a consequence to that and it has to happen. But, I don't think Larry and Sergey were like, hey, how do we make money? In fact, I think they were kind of pulled kicking and screaming into that part of it. But, and so when suddenly it was very much first a business, that became quite challenging. And I think it also bred a sort of dysfunction in the relationship between government and what government calls industry, a term that really we don't use anywhere else when we talk about the partners you use to solve problems. And it's that like you're transactional, you're money grubbing, I am doing this mission here. I've given up a lot to work in the government. And I think I think we can really fix that. And we have this opportunity that's happened right now because of how much interest there is in defense tech.
Just so I understand then, the problem is the mindset chasm between your profiteering private companies and we're here for a mission of being the government. Is that the core industrial problem?
Well, I think that's a consequence of it. The core industrial problem is that we don't have a way to reward mavericks and innovators, that we've historically bred a marketplace that's driven towards conformity. We all have the same business model. We all want to get paid by the hour. Hey, I don't want to take risk because I need to know you're going to buy this government. There's no way for VC to be applied here because I can't figure out how to get to a scale of return that's going to matter.
Does that change in a time of leverage? And what I mean by that is in peace times, you're absolutely right. People can wait. They can say, I want to pay by the hour. When there is sadly conflicts around the world and you need to buy and you need to innovate and improve, you and private companies have leverage to say, align to our business model or don't buy. Does time not change that?
I'm forgetting Churchill's chief of the general staff, but he had, I think it was Fields maybe, but he had an observation, which is that when you go to war, the first thing you need to do is fire all your generals. Like generals that succeed in peacetime are, and this was a general himself, right? The generals that succeed in peacetime are not the right generals to succeed in war, and vice versa. And really, what I'm saying there is something a little smaller, which is that when there is war, you do have a different sort of mobilization. You have a different sort of leadership. People are willing to make different decisions. It's almost like the only thing that works when it really matters is breaking the process and doing what's right. And the process never really works. It's kind of a digression from the main point around this. But I think you don't have leverage in the sense that, look, you're going to buy whatever model works. It's the opposite, which is the leadership says, oh, I'm willing to break the model because I see what's right. I didn't, it's not, like there wasn't a problem big enough to solve before. So I wasn't going to change how we did business. I have a problem to solve. And I, as a leader, I'm going to say, yes, this is the right path.
Can I ask, if we go back to the days of Lockheed Martin, the founders innovating there, was there a political structure that was flexible enough then to make the changes that we need to happen now?
I think there was almost a lack of political structures. There was a willingness to move fast and break things. Kelly Johnson, and when I say founder, I really mean it in the broadest sense of the word. It's almost like renegade, maverick, innovator. Kelly Johnson is one of my favorite examples of this. This is the guy who founded Skunkworks at Lockheed Martin. This guy, we would recognize him as a 100X engineer in the Valley today, right? 23 years old, joins Lockheed Martin, looks at a 2D diagram of schematics of a plane and says, this plane is fatally flawed. He goes to the senior engineer at Lockheed, and almost to get rid of Kelly, he's like, well, why don't you fix it? And of course, he fixed it. So this guy built 26 airframes in his career. Today, if you're an aerospace engineer, you're lucky to work on a third of a plane over your entire career. So you're never even going to ship a plane. And this guy shipped 26. And some of his planes, like the U-2, we still fly. He built the first U-2 in 9 months. We can do this again, right? There's a way in which we've built up so much process, so much risk aversion. In order to constrain, I think that the greatest travesty of all of this is it's like, in order to constrain the variance in outcomes, we have constrained ourselves to mediocrity. It's like we don't want projects to fail catastrophically, but that also means you can't have projects succeed catastrophically. And the amount of process we put in place just ensures mediocrity.
What worries me also is the procurement process and the tenders are so challenging that for anyone other than, I'm not picking on them, but just the most well-known, than like your Lockheed Martins, you can't engage in even the tender process because also you don't have the insurance premiums to cover some of the guarantees that are required on the directors. Only they have that large an insurance premium. And so it just means that in the end, only one or two go for them. I'm sure Palantir are now in that league, but it really is a constraint on innovation having such a stringent tender process.
I think it is. I've been thinking about this. It's dangerous to say this because if you take me too literally, it'll sound politically unpopular. But in an effort to have a perception of fair competition, we have created so much process that we neither have fair competition nor speed. And so we should really and I think if you could just juxtapose the European procurement process, which I've seen, the US process and maybe alternatives, and I'd say the European process is even more slow because there's an even greater emphasis on how do I show fairness across all of the EU states. And, and so then you could say, okay, the American process is a little more streamlined, but it still takes years. Why do these? So we're talking about Kelly Johnson could build a plane in 9 months. We can't even procure something in twice that long. That's crazy, right? And it's not because we're not competent enough to do it. It's because we have created a structure where we do not want protests. We do not want to be blamed. We do not want to lose public trust in how these decisions are made. But I think we are retarding the growth of the human capital in government as a consequence of this. You know what? You can make mistakes. That's how you're going to learn. Yeah, no one wants to make mistakes. No one wants to be wrong. I wish we could all be right all the time. But I have screwed up so many things at this company over 18 years. And if the standard of surviving here was something like you can never be wrong, or you must optically be seen to be making every decision in a way that, it will never blow back on you, like this company would not exist. I would be screwed. It's not a way to actually make the world better.
Which country has the best process, do you find? US is more streamlined than Europe. Does anyone stand out as being good?
I think the most honest answer to that question is America actually does have the best process when we're serious. When there's the political will and alignment and the problem is clear and we're ready to go, that's when we throw all the rules and the doctrine out the window and we go and we get it done. And this is kind of the Churchillian thing, right? The Americans screw everything up until they've exhausted all the options and then they do the right thing. And so that's the other part that makes it frustrating is we are so clearly capable of this. I've seen it demonstrated in our greatest moments of need. But in the steady state, we reject it.
So when you put your mind to it, you can do it. You said that the DoD needs to pick a winner. How do you think about what that would look like in reality?
Pick winners, plural, to be very clear. So I think this is one of the greatest disconnects, I'd say, between the hyper-growth technology community and DoD. So we've had roughly $100 billion of venture investment enter defense tech recently, last couple of years. And the VC model is not that everyone needs to be a mediocre outcome, right? Like I'd say the median return in a venture fund might be 0, but the average return is maybe 2, 3x, right? Like for the portfolio. And so this is the dynamics that matter, which is like the peanut butter spreading, as it's kind of called. Like I have this much money and I'm going to spread it across all of the companies that have come in here. That just ensures that they're all zombies. They're neither alive nor dead. It ensures that all that capital, those firms are not going to be able to raise their next round. There's not enough return. And a much better strategy is realizing, look, we need to pick a few winners and we're going to go after it with scale. And these companies are going to become large as a consequence, which then allows those funds to go bring more money and innovation in our ecosystem. And there's a virtuous cycle here. And the talent is going to stay. So maybe their one company didn't work out, but they're going to have many shots at the apple. We're going to have this ravenous new tech industrial base focused on defense problems with the capital behind it and the economics that support it. Now, there's this is the part the DoD is a little uncomfortable with, which is like, well, I'd rather it's a little bit more an aesthetic towards like fair socialist returns. Like I just want to spread out the money across all of these participants so that no one's upset. But I think in reality, everyone will be upset. And if you talk to these venture capitalists, which, I'm not one of them, but if you talk to them, like, yes, I'd prefer that my companies win. But I prefer, if that's not possible, someone has to win because otherwise this market's not going to exist. And getting the Defense Department to realize, so one of the greatest lies they tell themselves is we don't pick winners. If you interact with acquisition folks, you'll get this sort of thing. Oh, we don't pick winners. But no, literally, you're a monopsonist. Every contract you award, you're picking a winner. So we have to kind of regroove how we do this to support the broader ecosystem.
I don't envy it at all. One thing I do worry about, when we said about that kind of spread and the diversification, is actually the nationalization of buying, which sounds incredibly intelligent, but it's actually quite simple, really, which is just countries and kind of continents would rather buy their own suppliers' products. So Europe would rather buy a European company's product. America would rather buy an American. You're not going to buy Chinese defense tech. For obvious reasons.
I think there's two dimensions to this. One is you don't want to be beholden to your adversaries. So that's like an obvious one I think everyone can agree to. The second dimension to this is we often forget that one of the roles of government is its economic role. There's an aspect of government that is a jobs program, that is welfare for the people, and that's okay. I think where it gets tricky with defense is where that's the case and it's unacknowledged. So in the US, we have these SBIR programs, these small business innovation kind of grants or research. To a VC, this is like the kiss of death. Research, study after study shows that you get these SBIR grants and your company never actually achieves scale. They don't really want to invest in the companies that are pursuing this. It's not a strategy to actually become a big company. It's a strategy to stay a zombie. So I think we'd be better off asking ourselves, okay, if we want the SBIR program, if we believe in small business and the aesthetic of small business, this is a type of like white collar jobs program. And that might be quite good. It's creating more STEM jobs. That's a policy question I'll leave to our policymakers. But we should not think that from this program, we're going to get massive defense innovation. We're going to get new champions. We're going to get competition. We're going to get any of the transformation that we actually need to win these next fights.
Can I ask you a bit of a direct one, which is like, I'm a venture investor for a living. The most beautiful thing in the world is when you see TAMs expanding. Uber moving from chauffeur-driven cars to the car for everyone is a beautiful and very clear example of just an expansion of TAM. When conflict arises and budgets increase significantly, as callous as it sounds, it's an expanding TAM. I said that, not you, so I can shield any problems for that.
I'd flag two things there. One is we are spending at historic lows relative to the Cold War, like as a percentage of GDP. So absolute dollars, yes, are bigger. But as a percentage of GDP, like what do you think is the defense insurance premium the country should pay every year to protect, Pax Americana and the Western international rules-based order? So policymakers can have views about that or something, but to view our budget right now.
What is it in context of GDP? 15%?
2 to 3%.
What was it in the Cold War?
At its peak, I think it's like when you look at like Vietnam, you look at other periods of the Cold War, it's like closer to 6. Yeah, 5 to 6%. So we should double check my numbers there, but let's call it roughly. It's like half of as a percent of GDP, and I think that's kind of true. And I'm not sure that it should double. That's not the point. But I think like we somehow view this in a context of like I think we could view it as like what is the insurance premium we're willing to pay on GDP to protect GDP?
What do you think it should be?
I think it's between where we are now and where it was during the Cold War. And you know, it's like it was absolutely right to get even though we suffered long-term consequences of the Last Supper. I don't think you could have political legitimacy without having a peace dividend after the Cold War. So I think what happened was correct. But now we should analyze what needs to happen in the context of great power competition. Like we do not live in that world anymore. It has changed radically. And we have developed some sclerotic habits of 30 years of living at, quote unquote, the end of history that we need to really shake off and organize against. And no place more so than Europe, where in many ways they've kind of forgotten, they've forgotten the distant past and have enjoyed a lot of what the West collectively has been able to create.
Can I ask you, have you seen conversations change since sadly Israel, but Russia? Like, has the discussion changed with buyers in terms of their tone, their requirement? Like, just has the world changed significantly then, or has it continued in the same way?
The buyers here are very serious people who wake up every day thinking, I might have to fight tonight, or I'm in the position of providing capability to people who might have to fight tonight. So I don't feel a shift in tone. What I do feel is a shift in the rate of learning. What is there to learn from? You look at the tactics, you look at what is working on the battlefield. And many of these things are surprising. They're different. They're innovating very quickly. They're changing the concepts of what you think you would even need to buy to have survivable capability, to win the next conflict. And that is evolving incredibly rapidly. And I think it continues to speak to this concept of lower cost, attritable capabilities. Instead of buying something that you think like an aircraft carrier or some space-based capability that's going to be around for 30 or 50 years, and because it's going to be around that long, it's going to be so expensive, it's got to just be perfect. It's like, I'm buying something I might use for the next year. You look at Ukraine, many of these drones are single-use drones. So there is no sustainment. Like, what are we talking about here? There's like your whole supply chain changes, like the whole theory of how you're going to employ the weapon is very, very different. And as a consequence, the logistics you need around it become very different. And that can liberate you to have entirely new concepts, entirely new business models that enable you to deliver the innovation, recognizing that what you're going to fight with in 2 years is not what you're going to fight with in a year, and it's not what you'd use today.
Can I ask a really strange one, but a direct one? If you were to be in charge of the DoD today, what would you do from the procurement process, from the budgets, from deployment? What would you do if you were in charge?
If I had one magic wand, one wish, it would be to return to a structure that we actually used to use, which is to have multiple competing programs to go after the same capability. So when we were building submarine-launched ballistic missiles, we didn't have one program to build it. I think we had 4. And this allowed, there's a human factors element to this, and there's a practical technology element to this. Well, we weren't sure if they should be solid-fueled, liquid fueled. There was all sorts of technical questions. And so you can either have the loudest voice win, or you could do a forever, never-ending research project, or you can compete the ideas. And that means, you're going much faster, you're learning, you're iterating. It's an empirical discussion rather than a theoretical one. You're buying down technology risk. But I think what's even more compelling than that is the human factor. I often think about what would motivate so many of these programs, like what would motivate the program manager to want to go faster, to want to insert new technologies more quickly? And the answer is nothing, because the distant threat of an enemy for a conflict that you might want to fight one day does not warrant blowing up your schedule, introducing risk, maybe having someone yell at you because you're just judged by cost, schedule, performance. And that's all you're going to think about. But I don't think that's healthy. And I think, so my counterfactual would be, what if there were 2 PMs who woke up every day? It's human competition. It's like, the government is going to buy some percentage of my product, some percentage of their product. And I am going to wake up every day to win this. That's like a uniquely American thing. I think we're very good at that. And I think it is going to drive a lot of innovation. It solves a lot of the problems. Like, how do we get things to be cheaper? Well, I want the government to buy more of my products, so I'm going to build it cheaper. How do I insert new technologies? How do I go faster? Like, these problems are actually kind of a lack of internal competition. The government focuses on competition in the industrial base. I think there's not enough competition inside of government.
Is winning this attributable? Like, if you think about single-use drones as an example, does someone in DC have attribution on their procurement process working out, it being a good buy, it being effective, when it's deployed 4 months later in wherever it is, miles, thousands of miles away? Is there attribution?
Yeah, there's definitely going to be ex post attribution, but how do we get closer to something ex ante? How are you making that decision? So today, there is a pretty big disconnect between the people who are responsible for fighting, really the combatant commanders, and the people who are responsible for providing the equipment. And really, these guys, the fighters, they don't really have a vote. They don't have, and I think that's one of the things we need to change, where winning the competition should really be about, okay, well, how much does the Indo-PACOM commander or the CENTCOM commander want of this variant versus that competing variant? And it doesn't have to be winner take all. It can be something like, I want 20% of these and 80% of those, and next year, come back to me with better ideas. Let me taste the steaks and see which one I like, and I might allocate resources differently next time. And I think getting that faster feedback iteration cycle would be super valuable. It also lets us be a little bit more critical of quote unquote requirements. The requirements are the things that must, we've done this analysis and we said these things must exist and we're going to build all of them. Well, clearly requirements change. The only thing you know for sure is the requirements are wrong. And so how do we enable our program managers to take more risk and say, well, I think these requirements are more important than those requirements. And I think there are requirements they haven't even thought of that really matter. Because at the end of the day, you got to taste the steak. You got to taste, you got to feel the product, use the product. And that's the only way you're going to know if it's good or not. And it's that, can you imagine if the Valley didn't have something like that with its buyers, that the way that every new product was going to be evaluated was through a historical list of requirements that someone else came up with and a paper PowerPoint exercise to see which product someone was going to buy. No, we innovate because we fight with our technology in the customer's office.
Can I ask you, how do leadership changes impact buying processes? I know that's a weird one, but as you look towards elections, both in the UK, the US, do discussions just kind of break down because everyone's wondering which government will be in power? How does it change processes?
I think much less than people think. There's obviously some effect, and I think it varies by country. And in the UK system, given how involved the cabinet is with approving contracts and the oversight and integration with Treasury, it's actually more relevant in terms of what agenda people will be following. In the US, I think the bigger issue is really Congress and whether there's a budget or not. We don't have a budget, we'll enter a continuing resolution. In a continuing resolution, that means you can't have any new starts. So all the things the department wants to do, they're gated and waiting until there is a new budget. And this is a consequence of our system. I think it's a little facile to say Congress should just pass the budget on time, and that would be a nice world. But this is how we exercise political power and arrive at consensus. And I think there are things that we can do to make this better, but I think that's kind of the bigger issue in the U.S.
Is there anything that Silicon Valley and VCs could do to better serve the defense market? We've spoken a lot about the role of government and selling to government. On the flip side, for the VCs like me of the world, what could we do better to serve defense tech more efficiently?
If you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have had a long list of things that I think the capital class could be doing better to help in the national interest. I don't have those critiques. The capital class has showed up. The capital has showed up. The entrepreneurs have showed up. People are working on these problems. And it's just, it gets me so excited. Now, I think to the extent I had an ask from the VCs, it would be to engage with the policymakers so they understand the dynamics of your business. What is it going to take so that the $100 billion or more continues to show up? What does it take for these entrepreneurs to stay in this ecosystem? Why is a labor-based business model so bad? Because I think we can underestimate the size of the gulf between these two worlds. And you could even say it as something as simple as, in DC, there's this like no conflict of interest. Like if you have, this idea of like, we're going to manage all the conflicts of interest. And if you have any conflict of interest, it's very bad. And obviously conflict of interest can be bad. On the other hand, in the Valley, it's like, well, if you haven't invested in something, how do you even have an opinion about it? Like you're not even willing to put your own money behind an idea. So what do you know about it? It's like, it's almost like no conflict, no interest. And there's a middle ground between these things. But I think that's the first place to kind of get the relationship groove so people understand it. So it really comes down to high trust human interaction. We're not going to scale this through process. It's going to come down to these two worlds coming together. And they've never been closer, but we still have a lot of work to do there.
I do want to move a little bit of a layer deeper just into the company level with Palantir. You said something that I thought was fascinating. You said content, not process, is the eternal substance. I was like, right, good. That's helpful. Thank you. That's helpful, Shyam. What did you mean content, not process, is the eternal substance?
Steve Jobs has this great Lost interview about how companies get confused, that when they're trying to replicate their success, they look at the process they went through to deliver their first success. And then they follow the process and it doesn't work because actually, the first and most important thing is the content. It's the creativity, it's the substance. And that substance rarely, and as he points out, people who are good at content tend to be a pain in the ass to manage. They're a pain in the butt, I think was his quote. But you put up with them because the content is just so good. And so I think there's this way in which process as a medicine is okay. It's like, can you have zero process? No. But if you hold process up as the deity, if process ends up being what is actually an opioid, it's very bad. It's like, look, we just need to follow the process and we'll get to the outcome. That's almost never correct. The process is going to, when the process becomes more important than the content, you're going to lose. And a lot of this comes up as like, well, I wish the interaction could be less frictionful. I wish there was more predictability. I wish there was all sorts of things which are just not true in the real world. Like, yes, we all wish the world could be different. But when you honor what the world is, you kind of recognize how important it is to have the right rock band, right? There's no, hey, follow this process and we're going to get there.
Does that scale though? Because the challenge is you need process with scaling teams, with increasing team sizes, and the magicians who come up with great content, it's really hard to have structure around that.
You need some way of having both, but you can't ever lose the primacy of content. To put it this way, you can get really far with incredible content and bad process. You're going to get nowhere with incredible process and bad content. And so the primacy of it, you need to keep in mind. And this is what I mean by process as medicine versus opioid. And so there's a role for this here. But and I feel like, Palantir is this company that keeps reinventing itself, which is a whole other discussion we can kind of get to. But in those moments of reinvention, there's just content. There's just the crazy content and your commitment to it and making it better. And then you figure out how to get it to scale. And sometimes maybe getting things to scale is itself not scalable. Which I don't mean as a critique. It's more like first you got to figure out the substance and then you work really hard every day to get it to scale. There's an old Silicon Valley saying, there's the first 80% and the second 80%. And so maybe there's a little bit of this in this where it's like, yeah, the first part of the content is 80% of the work. And then getting it to scale through process is 80% of the work.
Can I ask you, it's so hard to hire because you need to be able to detect those magicians, but then you also need to hire for process around them as well. And there is room for structure in both, as you said. When you reflect on hiring, you said talent spotting eats strategy for breakfast. How do you think about talent spotting and how has how you approach it changed over time?
Yeah, I think this is so important. I think there's a way in which we've kind of constrained our cultures and our companies because we've leaned into the opioid of structure, essentially. Like, look, I'm going to structure my company as a factory. You're going to here are all the roles and the levels I have, and here's the org chart, and it's all very clean and laid out. And if you play by these rules, you can figure out how to navigate. I think one of the challenges is that like really talented people are highly asymmetric. You're much better off designing a role around who they are rather than saying, what role can I slot you into? It's almost like definitionally, none of those roles are going to fit them. It's going to put them in a position of relative weakness. They're going to blow something up. They're going to feel like they have to be good at something they're never going to be good at. And so it's a total evisceration of their potential. And if you said, look, instead of being a factory, we're going to be an artist colony. I don't get Dali to paint better by yelling at him to paint more like Monet. It's like each one of these individuals is an individual. And I'm going to go on a journey to craft a role around who they are, and I'm going to make it okay for them to like flex their role to meet their capabilities. And even more importantly, artists' work don't monotonically get better. This idea that you're going to climb levels in this sort of strictly increasing way, I think is deeply inauthentic. Some of your works are going to be hits, and then you're going to go through a lull, and your work might not be great. The community might not appreciate it. And then your next piece is going to be a masterpiece. And so how do you get into a place where you can be committed to your talent over a long duration? There's going to be ups and downs, but they're so fundamentally talented that you're going to stick with them, and you're not going to be judging them work to work. It's not like a daily mark to market. It's like, look, you are special. This is a home for you. And we value you over this long arc of what we're building together. And that means that when they're not performing, you don't suddenly have this responsibility to sideline them and put them in a hole or fire them. And I think in a factory, you kind of do.
But let's just break that one down. So with those special people, when you think about the commonalities in what makes those magicians magic, when you look back at the ones you've hired and talent spotted, are there commonalities in them?
I wish I could say, I spent a lot of time trying to like systematize, like, okay, well, how can we systematize what makes these magicians? And I think there's an element of, really great town spotters just know. I don't think I'm the best at town spotting. I think I'm okay at it. But when I think about Dr. Karp, when I think about Joe, the number of the first 50 people that Joe personally recruited and town spotted, when they had no practice, they're like 22, 23, there's no track record. It's not like you're looking at a prior body of work and saying, look at what you've done. It's just like, I still kind of look back at how Joe picked those people, and it's like, it's incredible. And I think there's a real skill to that. And if you have that ability, you're almost like a talent agent in the Hollywood sense, pulling, you're the modern Ovitz of Silicon Valley.
Okay. So if you're kind of God-given with this talent structure or talent spotting ability, great. But in terms of creating the environment where they are able to fail, create masterpieces as well, how do you think about doing that as I hate saying here, but as their manager or as the person responsible for their work?
Yeah, I think, we could keep leaning into the Hollywood metaphor here of the talent agent and the talent, and how do you manage talent is a very open-ended question, but I think that's roughly how you would think about it, which is like, look, I'm really here to support. I need to create the environment that allows your art to flourish. I'm not the one managing your art. And so if you think about that, okay, they need a huge amount of autonomy. They need the resources. They need some protections from the daily distractions of certain aspects of the business. I think if you're always inhaling the full visceral, scary reality of everything going on, I think that distracts you from doing the art. So how do you have complete autonomy over an area that you're very, very good at, and the ability then to execute against it? And then I think a kind of maxim I always think about is smart people cannot be taught anything. They can learn, and that's the environment you're trying to set up. It's like, how do I create this environment of maximum learning for these incredibly talented artists?
Can I ask, what happens if you continuously do duds? What if the masterpieces don't show?
Yeah, I think the artists might even blow up at that point. Our artists want their art to be really good too. So, if they're really going through a rough patch for a long time, that might be part of I think that's going to be a judgment call as the talent manager. No, I really believe, I understand this is a long, dry spell here, but I'm going to keep you motivated. I'm keep you managing. I'm going to figure it out. But of course, you could just be wrong. Maybe the moment has passed. The art and the inspiration and the muse doesn't exist.
Do you think is it potentially a bit of an ideological perspective to take? Because suddenly I tell you that your budgets have been cut. We're doing a 15% layoff. Sorry, artists, you haven't hit it out of the park for quite some time. Shyam?
Yeah, I think there are sometimes there's just external realities. Like you may have to do that because that's reality. And I think, there is something, this is one of those things you have to think about how you shield, or when you choose to shield the artist from, like budgets. Budgets are anti-creative. Constraints are important, don't get me wrong. But I think like budgets are just anti-creative. So you have to think about what's the right mix of like, hey, at this moment, we really need budgets. It matters for these reasons. And here's why. And so I think you tend to find that like you kind of oscillate between two ends of a continuum, right? Like there's no budgets, it's free for all, it's max creative. It's like, oh, this is completely ungoverned and we need, this thing. And you're just trying to maintain the unstable equilibrium rather between these points.
VCs love to say something. Constraints enforces creativity. Do you agree with that, with the idea that budgets are anti-creative? Because budgets are constraints.
I definitely agree that constraints drive creativity, 100%. Now, I think you can be overly constrained. So I already have a time constraint, I have a customer constraint, I have a problem constraint, and maybe the budget constraint blows it up. What you really want, that's the job of the talent manager, is to manage to the budget without exposing the brutal reality of the budget to the talent. How can I get the talent to feel a few less constraints while actually being constrained?
You mentioned mistakes over 18 years. I've made many mistakes in hiring. When you reflect on yours, what have been some of your biggest hiring mistakes, and how did that change how you actually approach hiring?
My biggest hiring mistakes were hiring for a factory. Actually, as I say it now, I think it was like hiring what I thought I would need, hiring what the world told me, the way to solve this problem is to hire this profile. I didn't earn it from first principles. Like the most successful ones have always been when I took the talent and grew them into the roles that actually reflected their talent. And the worst mistakes were it's where I tried to import a solution to a problem, because that's my version of the opioid. Wouldn't it be nice if I could just magically import this solution and it will solve all my problems in this area? I think I'm like 0 for 10. It's never worked for me.
So what do you do now?
First principles. Who do I have? How can I give people more responsibility? How can I stretch them? How do I bet on just raw talent? And when I'm out there meeting people, and I still spend a fair amount of time doing this, I'm not really even thinking about the role. I'm thinking about this human. And it's like, would I be excited to fight shoulder to shoulder with this person over the next decade? And can I imagine continuing to invest and grow in them to take on more problems? And if they're talented, I'll figure out the role. They'll figure out the role. We have so many needs.
When you've been wrong, what did you get wrong about that decision? So like for me, I've been wrong actually often on my surprise, where I've hired very boring people. And my secret to hiring is hire boring people, because no one's quite as boring as they seem in a job interview. But they will always be humble if they're boring in the interview. And so I find hire the boring.
And it just might be a reflection of Palantir too. But I think that the form of the mistake is thinking that outside knowledge will translate here without a massive retranslation function. And so the sort of personality that's like, look, I've solved this problem before, I know the answer, versus I'm betting on my talent to be able to solve the answer. That's the shape of the challenge.
Can I ask one final one before we do a quick fire? But you mentioned that Palantir's had quite a few transformations or reincarnations. What do you think was the most challenging reincarnation that Palantir made, and why that one?
I honestly think all of them have been challenging. And the reason they're challenging, there's the work, which is more obvious. The less obvious part of this sort of reinvention is reinventing yourself. It's the toll on the individual, where you're like, look, but I got this thing and it's at this place and it's successful. And where is my like earned credibility from having done that? And in the reinvention, what you're saying is no, like every single person, we're starting from zero. And it might be true that some person who joined this company 2 months ago is going to be more sophisticated at this new problem than you who joined 5 years ago. And that's, there's a commitment to pushing through that. And I think it's actually only survivable because the whole thing is set up as an artist colony.
Is it not harder with more people? Because you have to re-engage, recommunicate that to 2,000, 1,000, whatever that number is. Whereas when there's 100, it's much easier. So actually the reincarnation gets harder over time.
That's one aspect that gets harder. Let me give you one aspect that gets easier. The first few times we're doing it, I felt this deep personal responsibility to like handhold everyone through their own reinvention. And that is exhausting. And I felt their pain of it. And it's not that I don't feel it now, but I now recognize like that's the medicine. Like I was trying to minimize the pain of their reinvention, but actually their greatness is going to come from going through this crucible and being proud of how they reinvented themselves. So now I kind of view it as I view it proudly rather than with trepidation.
Shyam, I want to move into a quick fire round. So I say a short statement, you give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great.
Okay, so where does value accrue in AI? Startups or incumbents, and why?
I think it biases towards the incumbents who own applications in the app layer.
Why?
I think the model is going to be commoditized because the models are not going to really give you enough of the value. It turns out that like you have the model, then getting to a business outcome with that model happens in an application. And so if you own those pixels, you're going to be able to apply it more quickly. I also think that very few problems are 100% AI. They're like a third AI, a third traditional deterministic code, a third human thought. And the only place you can drive that elegant integration is at the app layer.
So you think we'll see the commoditization of LLMs?
I think so. I'm not saying some won't be better than others, but I'm saying most of them are going to be good.
No, I'm just interested because when you look at, say, I don't know, cloud over the last 10 years, cloud has relatively been commoditized in terms of like actual product offering, but the biggest players are huge and they're in the infrastructure layer, and they are the same size as 100 application layer companies. And so I'm just wondering, I get you on the commoditization side, but I still think the value will accrue to those incumbents in the infrastructure layer.
I think they'll get a lot of the compute for sure. And that's yeah, and I should say I think the value is going to accrue in those two directions, infrastructure and app layer, and that the models are going to be squeezed.
I get you there. Can I ask, if you are a model company that doesn't own full vertical supply of compute, are you not screwed?
If I was a model company, I would be pushing into the app layer. I'd be trying to figure out how to own more of the value I'm creating with the model rather than just selling an endpoint. And this is usually the opposite advice you're going to get from traditional venture, where they're like, build something simple that scales with an API.
Every venture investor says, oh, it's a thin layer on top of an LLM. What's the difference between a thin layer and a thick layer in app world, do you think?
Well, I think a lot of their criticisms are right, that essentially if you're just building a chatbot, it's a pretty thin layer. So you could say, what makes it a thick layer is what's the use of deterministic code or algorithmic reasoning in addition to the LLM? What's the integration into workflow? How do humans, are we still chatting here? Are prompts for developers or for users?
Why do LLMs need tools?
Because otherwise you're completely constrained to the parametric knowledge of the model. And I think that's a Sisyphean task. People keep trying to jam more and more knowledge into the model, but what they fail to recognize is that these models are actually very good at speaking regular grammars. JSON, code, it's a regular grammar. How do you use these models in their current state to manage and manipulate application state?
Have the core LLM winners been already created, or will we see more over the next few years?
Some of the folks who have been created are definitely going to be core winners. I think there will be more winners to come.
Got you. Tell me, who do you think the winner's been so far?
Unquestionably, OpenAI has done quite well. I think we have some time to see where does Google really shake up in all of this. And I think Meta has, it's amazing to see how much they've reinvented themselves around this.
Do you worry that development is so far ahead of adoption? I think we all overly get excited. And actually, 50% of European corporates don't know what Slack is.
I think the fear I really have here is how much are we modeling the appropriate use, and how fixated are we on proof of value instead of proof of concept? We had a self-driving car demo in 2005. It drove 132 miles through the desert. That's really impressive. That's not a toy-like demo. You could argue only in 2023 did we have a proof of a self-driving car that could drive around the city reliably as a commercial offering. Nobody wants to be in that business. No enterprise wants to adopt this thing where the demos are amazing and 20 years from now, they might be able to put this in production. And I think as technologists, in order for us to not be in a bubble, we need to be really focused on proof, not proof of concepts, and the speed by which we can affect these enterprises.
What have you changed your mind on in the last 12 months?
Content and process. Look, content has always mattered, but I always had this view that it's got to scale. I'm now willing to fight incrementally, almost like trench warfare to get things to scale.
You can,
as long as the process is, content is gorgeous.
You can have dinner with one person, dead or alive. Who would it be, and what would you ask them?
I'd probably Begin, former prime minister of Israel, one of the founding fathers. I think it's just, I'm so obsessed with the conditions around founding. You could also pick a U.S. founding father. I think we don't study that the mindset of 1776, the unlikelihood of this, the unlikelihood of founding the modern Israel state, how difficult it was. I just want to relish those founder stories.
What was your biggest lesson from working with Alex?
Probably the most important one is this idea of the artist colony, that humans are unique individuals and that you maximize value by staying true to that and never letting yourself aggregate or think about them as a class.
I love that. Tell me, final one. What do the next 5 years hold for you and for Palantir? It's 2028. We sit down again. Where are we then?
I think the world is likely to change much more in the next 5 years than most people are modeling. The geopolitics are highly unstable. That maybe is a more obvious statement now to say after October 7th. Today is the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, the day that will live in infamy. And I think we're entering a very challenging time here. And I think that has consequences for the commercial world as well as governments. But the other aspect of this is, as we approach that sort of instability, what is the role for real transformation? Like, we have this unique opportunity with AI to actually change things, not just to build businesses, but to fix many of the problems that drive at the fundamental legitimacy of the institutions we have in the world. Why don't these institutions work? Well, I am not someone who thinks you're going to fix them by tearing them down. You're going to fix them by partnering with them and helping the humans who wake up every day trying to make their institutions work better.
Listen, Shyam, I've loved this. This has been so nice to do one where I'm not talking about pre and post money valuations. It's been a very different style, but you've been fantastic. So thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thank you, Harry, for having me. It's been fun.